In December 1944, as American families prepared for Christmas and the Allied forces pushed toward Germany's borders, approximately 10,000 German teenagers sat in freezing bunkers and makeshift shelters along the Western Front, writing what would become their final letters home. These boys, most between 15 and 17 years old, had been hastily conscripted into the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS during the Third Reich's final desperate months. They were about to be thrown into Hitler's last major offensive in the West, a massive assault through the Ardennes Forest that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Within weeks, nearly all of them would be dead, their bodies frozen in the Belgian snow, their carefully written Christmas letters the last communication their families would ever receive. These were not the hardened veterans who had stormed across Poland in 1939 or marched triumphantly into Paris in 1940. These were children who should have been in school, learning algebra and reading Goethe, not loading ammunition and cleaning rifles. They had been pulled from their classrooms, Hitler youth meetings, and apprenticeships as Germany scraped the bottom of its manpower barrel. Many had received less than 6 weeks of training before being designated as combat ready. Some had never fired their weapons at a living target. They knew how to march, how to salute, and how to die for the fatherland. But most had never experienced actual combat. The letters they wrote in those early December days reveal a heartbreaking mixture of childish naivety and forced adult bravery. They wrote about missing their mother's cooking, about hoping to be home for New Year's if not Christmas, about the friends they had made in their units who came from different parts of Germany. They asked about pets, younger siblings, and neighborhood gossip. They tried to sound brave and optimistic, following military censorship rules that prohibited discussing troop movements, positions, or morale problems. But between the lines, fear seeped through like water through a cracked dam. Hans Müller, age 16, from a small village outside Munich, wrote to his mother on December 10, 1944. His handwriting, preserved in archives, shows the careful penmanship of a schoolboy trying to write neatly, despite frozen fingers. He told her about the chocolate the unit had received, though he didn't mention it was their only food for 2 days. He asked her to thank his little sister for the socks he had knitted, though he didn't tell her that his feet were already showing signs of frostbite. He promised to bring home a souvenir from France, though he was actually positioned in Belgium and had been told they would be attacking within days. The context these boys found themselves in was one of complete military desperation. By December 1944, Germany had lost millions of soldiers on the Eastern Front, where the Soviet army was pushing relentlessly westward. The Western Allies had successfully invaded Normandy 6 months earlier and liberated most of France. Germany was being bombed day and night by Allied air forces. Any rational military assessment would have concluded that the war was lost. But Adolf Hitler, increasingly detached from reality in his bunker, had convinced himself that one massive surprise offensive in the West could split the Allied forces, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Americans and British to negotiate a separate peace. For this offensive, Hitler had assembled what remained of Germany's military strength, including these hastily trained teenage soldiers. The boys had been told they were Germany's last hope, that their sacrifice would save the fatherland from destruction. They had been raised on Nazi propaganda since childhood, members of the Hitler Youth since age 10, indoctrinated to believe that dying for Germany was the highest honor. But propaganda was one thing, and the reality of impending combat was another entirely. Wilhelm Schneider, 17 years old, from Hamburg, wrote his last letter on December 14th. He had been drafted just 8 weeks earlier, pulled from his job as an apprentice mechanic. In his letter, he tried to explain to his father why he hadn't written more often. The truth was that he could barely hold a pencil. After long days of digging defensive positions in frozen ground, his hands were cracked and bleeding, and 2 of his fingers had lost feeling. But he wrote that he had been busy with training and duties, keeping the real situation hidden. He asked his father to oil his bicycle chain, so it would be ready when he returned. The bicycle would rust in the family shed, waiting for an owner who would never come home. The German military situation these boys entered was catastrophic. Units that were supposed to have 800 men might have 300. Equipment was falling apart and couldn't be replaced. Many of the teenage soldiers were issued captured foreign weapons for which ammunition was scarce. They wore uniforms cobbled together from different sources, some wearing boots taken from dead soldiers. The promised winter clothing never materialized, leaving them to face the coldest winter in decades, with summer uniforms stuffed with newspaper for insulation. Kurt Fischer, 16 from Dresden, wrote to his grandmother on December 11th. He thanked her for the prayer card she had sent and told her he kept it in his breast pocket. He didn't mention that he had already seen 2 friends killed by artillery fire during what was supposedly a quiet period before the offensive. He didn't describe how one of them, a boy named Joseph who had shared his rations, had been split nearly in half by shrapnel, dying while calling for his mother. Kurt wrote instead about hoping to see the spring flowers in his grandmother's garden, about the bird he had seen that reminded him of home, about anything except the reality surrounding him. The training these teenage soldiers had received was woefully inadequate for what they were about to face in the Germany of late 1944. With fuel shortages critical, tank crews might have driven an actual tank for only a few hours. Infantry training consisted mainly of marching, basic rifle drill, and political indoctrination. They learned to attack in human wave formations that belonged to an earlier era of warfare, tactics that would prove suicidal against American automatic weapons and artillery. They were taught that American soldiers were weak and cowardly, that they would run at the first sign of determined German resistance. This fantasy would cost thousands of young lives. The boys were organized into units with impressive-sounding names like the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth and various Volksgrenadier divisions. The names suggested elite status, but the reality was these units were shadows of what German divisions had once been. A panzer division might have only a dozen functioning tanks, instead of the 100 it was supposed to have. Artillery units lacked guns and ammunition. Supply services barely existed. These deficiencies would become fatal once the offensive began. Peter Hoffmann, age 17, wrote his final letter on December 13th. He had been something of a poet in school, and his letter contained carefully crafted descriptions of the winter landscape. He wrote about frost on pine trees that looked like nature's decorations, about stars visible through the forest canopy that reminded him of Christmas lights. What he didn't write about were the American reconnaissance planes that flew over daily, the constant fear of artillery bombardment, or the dysentery that was spreading through his unit because of contaminated water and poor sanitation. The officer corps leading these teenagers was itself decimated. Experienced officers had been killed in 5 years of war, replaced by men who in peacetime would never have risen above sergeant. Some platoons were led by boys barely older than the teenagers they commanded, promoted based on fanatical loyalty rather than military competence. The blind were leading the blind toward disaster. Many of these young officers were themselves writing final letters home. Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer, age 19, commanded a platoon of 40 teenage soldiers. His letter to his parents on December 12th revealed more than most. Perhaps because as an officer he felt he had less to lose from censorship. He wrote about his fears for his young charges, boys who looked up to him as if he were a veteran commander instead of someone who had received his commission just 3 months earlier. He expressed doubt about the upcoming offensive, wondering how they were supposed to achieve what seemed impossible. His letter was found on his body 3 weeks later by American soldiers. He had died trying to lead his teenage soldiers in a hopeless assault on an American position, cut down by machine gun fire along with most of his platoon. The boys wrote about practical matters too, revealing their youth in touching ways. They gave instructions about their belongings at home, as if organizing their childhood possessions could somehow guarantee their return. Thomas Wagner, 16, wrote detailed instructions about caring for his collection of stamps. Eric Brown, 17, reminded his younger brother about the hiding place where he had stashed some chocolate and cigarettes, telling him he could have them if he promised to share with their sister. These mundane details stand in stark contrast to the carnage they were about to enter. December 15, 1944, was the last day before the offensive. Across the front, teenage soldiers made final preparations and wrote final words. The letters from this day have a different quality, as if the boys somehow sensed what was coming. Many included messages for family members they hadn't written to before, aunts and uncles, school friends, former teachers. Some included confessions of fear that military censors would normally have deleted but were perhaps overlooked in the chaos of preparation. Martin Zimmerman, age 16, wrote the longest letter of his short life on December 15th. Over 4 pages he poured out memories of home, favorite meals his mother cooked, games he played with his brothers, walks with his father through the countryside. He seemed to be trying to preserve these memories on paper, as if writing them down could somehow protect them from what was coming. He sealed the letter with wax from a candle, using his thumb to make an impression, a gesture that seemed to formalize this document as his last will and testament. The religious content of many letters increased as December 16th approached. Boys who had been raised in the Nazi system, which discouraged traditional Christianity, suddenly found themselves reaching for faith. They quoted Bible verses learned in childhood. Before the Hitler Youth tried to replace religion with ideology, they asked for prayers, for blessings, for God's protection. The chaplains, what few remained with the units, were overwhelmed with requests for confession and communion. Franz Weber, 17, had been raised Catholic in Bavaria, despite the Nazi regime's hostility to the church. His letter on December 15th contained a full confession of sorts, apologizing to his parents for various childhood transgressions, thanking them for their patience and love, asking their forgiveness for anything he had done to disappoint them. He included a prayer his mother had taught him as a child, written in careful script as if the act of writing could serve as prayer itself. The economic desperation of Germany in late 1944 showed through in these letters. Boys asked their families not to send packages anymore, knowing that food was scarce at home. They told parents to keep warm clothes for themselves rather than sending them to the front. Some included their meager pay, insisting families use it for food and heating fuel. These teenagers, thrust into adult roles, were trying to provide for families they would never see again. Gerard Hartmann, 16, sent his entire December pay home with his last letter. It wasn't much, the Reichsmark was nearly worthless by then, but he insisted his mother use it to buy winter shoes for his younger sister. He had noticed in her last letter that she mentioned the girl's shoes were falling apart. This gesture of brotherly care, from a boy about to die in a meaningless offensive, captures the personal tragedies within the larger catastrophe of war. The night of December 15th to 16 was clear and cold. The teenagers tried to sleep in their bunkers and foxholes, knowing something major would happen in the morning, though most didn't know exactly what. Some stayed awake writing by candlelight, adding postscripts to letters, correcting spelling errors as if proper grammar could somehow improve their chances of survival. Others prayed, cleaned their weapons obsessively, or simply stared into the darkness thinking of home. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the German offensive began with a massive artillery barrage. The teenage soldiers emerged from their positions and advanced into the Ardennes Forest, many of them experiencing combat for the first time. The initial surprise was complete, and some units made significant advances. For a brief moment, it might have seemed that the promises of their commanders were true, that this offensive could change the war's outcome. But reality set in quickly. American units, after the initial shock, began to resist fiercely. The German advances slowed, then stopped. Supply lines, already stretched thin, broke down completely. The teenage soldiers found themselves without food, ammunition, or fuel, facing increasingly strong American counterattacks. The weather, initially favorable for hiding German movements, turned into a nightmare of snow and freezing temperatures that killed as effectively as bullets. The combat these teenagers experienced was nothing like their training or propaganda had prepared them for. American artillery, directed by forward observers and infinitely better supplied than German guns, created a hell of explosions that turned forest into matchsticks and men into unrecognizable fragments. The teenagers huddled in whatever cover they could find, some crying openly, others in catatonic shock, a few maintaining enough composure to follow orders that usually meant certain death. Michael Schultz, age 17, had written confidently to his parents about German military superiority. Within 3 days of the offensive start, his unit had lost 70% of its men. He was found dead on December 20th, his body frozen in a foxhole, along with 2 other teenage soldiers. They had apparently tried to huddle together for warmth after being wounded. The American soldiers who found them noted how young they looked, more like boys at a sleepover than enemy combatants. The lack of supplies became critical almost immediately. Units that were supposed to capture American supply dumps to fuel their advance failed to do so. The teenage soldiers, already weakened by months of poor nutrition, began to starve. They ate bark from trees, made soup from snow and grass, chewed on leather straps from their equipment. Hunger combined with cold and fear to break down unit cohesion. Some boys simply wandered off into the forest, delirious from hypothermia and starvation, their bodies found weeks later when the spring thaw came. Paul Becker, 16, had written cheerfully about the adventure of military service. By December 22nd, his unit had been surrounded near Bastogne. With no food for 4 days and ammunition running low, they attempted a breakout. Paul was killed by American machine gun fire, along with dozens of other teenage soldiers in what survivors described as a massacre. The Americans, not realizing how young their attackers were until examining the bodies, were shocked to find children among the dead. The promised air support never materialized. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, could barely put a handful of planes in the air. The teenage soldiers watched American fighter bombers attack with impunity, strafing and bombing their positions without opposition. They had been told about wonder weapons that would win the war, but all they had were obsolete rifles and their own bodies to throw against American firepower. The medics, themselves often teenagers with minimal training, were overwhelmed within hours of the offensive start. Aid stations ran out of bandages, morphine, and other basic supplies. Wounded teenagers lay in churches and barns, crying for their mothers while medics tried to stop bleeding with torn uniforms and prayer. Many died not from their initial wounds, but from shock and infection that basic medical supplies could have prevented. Hermann Kraus, a 17-year-old medic, had written home about his pride in helping wounded soldiers. By December 20th, he had seen more death than most doctors see in a lifetime. His aid station, set up in a Belgian farmhouse, was hit by American artillery on December 23rd. He died trying to drag wounded soldiers from the burning building, his last act one of heroism that no one would officially record or remember. The SS units, particularly those with high concentrations of teenage soldiers, were given the most impossible objectives. Indoctrinated to believe in their racial superiority and the righteousness of their cause, these boys threw themselves at American positions with suicidal determination. They had been taught that surrender was betrayal, that death was preferable to capture. Many fought to the last bullet, then charged with bayonets or even bare hands, rather than give up. Wolfgang Müller, 17, a member of the 12th SS, had written to his parents about his pride in serving in an elite unit. His body was found on December 26th among a group of teenage SS soldiers who had attempted to assault an American tank position on foot. They had no anti-tank weapons, only rifles and grenades. The American tankers, surveying the carnage afterward, counted 43 dead boys, none appearing older than 18. As the offensive stalled and American counterattacks began, The teenage soldiers faced a new horror. Retreat was forbidden by Hitler's direct order. Units that pulled back were to be shot by SS enforcement squads. The teenagers were trapped between American firepower ahead and German executioners behind. Some units simply disintegrated, with boys scattering into the forest, trying to find their way home or simply a place to die in peace. The weather became an enemy as terrible as the Americans. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Teenage soldiers without winter clothing froze to death in their foxholes. Others lost fingers and toes to frostbite. Some, driven mad by cold and hunger, walked into American lines with their hands raised, preferring captivity to continued suffering. Those who survived would describe the cold as a living thing that consumed their comrades one by one. Joseph Klein, 16, had written about his warm wool scarf, a gift from his grandmother. That scarf was found wrapped around his face when his frozen body was discovered in January 1945. He had apparently tried to create a small shelter from pine branches and had frozen to death while attempting to light a fire. Around him were scattered the letters from home he had been carrying, the ink running where snow had melted on them, the words of love and encouragement made illegible by the elements. By Christmas Day 1944, the German offensive had clearly failed. The teenage soldiers who had written home about being in Paris by New Year were instead dying in Belgian forests. Some units had ceased to exist entirely. Others were reduced to handfuls of survivors, traumatized beyond their ability to fight. The promised reserves never came because they didn't exist. The wonder weapons were fantasies. The only reality was death in the cold forest. On Christmas Eve, some American units reported hearing German soldiers singing "Still Knocked" from their positions. Among those voices were certainly teenage soldiers remembering Christmases at home when they were children, and the world made sense. The singing was sporadic and sad, lacking the defiant energy of earlier war Christmases. These boys knew they were going to die, and they sang not in celebration but in mourning for the lives they would never live. The letters that arrived at German homes in January 1945 were often accompanied by official death notifications. Families who had been reading cheerful notes about military life suddenly learned their sons had been dead for weeks. The German Postal Service, still functioning despite the bombing and chaos, delivered these final messages with cruel efficiency. Mothers collapsed reading words from sons already buried in unmarked graves. Fathers who had served in the First World War recognized the forced optimism and hidden fears in their sons' letters, understanding too late what their boys had been facing. Anna Muller received Hans's letter on January 15, 1945, exactly 1 month after he had died. She had already been notified of his death, but reading his words about coming home, about the socks from his sister, about bringing souvenirs from France, broke her in ways. The official telegram hadn't. She would keep that letter for the rest of her life, reading it every December, mourning not just her son, but all the boys who died in that frozen forest. The scale of teenage deaths in the Battle of the Bulge shocked even hardened Wehrmacht commanders. Entire graduating classes from German schools had been wiped out. Villages that had sent groups of boys off together received them back in coffins. When bodies could be recovered at all, many were simply listed as missing, their remains scattered in forests or buried in mass graves by American forces who couldn't identify the young bodies frozen in the snow. The 12th SS Panzer Division, which had started the offensive with over 20,000 men, mostly teenagers, had fewer than 4,000 combat-effective soldiers by January 1945. The Volksgrenadier divisions, filled with hastily trained boys, simply ceased to exist as fighting forces. Conservative estimates suggest that of the 10,000 teenage soldiers who wrote last letters home in early December 1944, fewer than 1,000 survived the battle, and many of those were permanently disabled by wounds or frostbite. The survivors who made it home found a Germany in ruins. Their families were often dead from bombing or starvation. Their schools were destroyed. The ideology they had been raised to believe in was revealed as a catastrophic lie. They had to live with memories of friends dying beside them, of committing acts they couldn't reconcile with their childhood selves, of participating in the final act of a regime that had stolen their youth and murdered their generation. Karl Dietrich, one of the few teenage survivors from his unit, returned home to find his family's apartment building destroyed by bombing. His parents and sister were dead. The letter he had written them on December 14th was returned to him, unopened, with addressee deceased stamped on it. He carried that letter for the rest of his life, never opening it, a physical reminder of the boy he had been and the family he had lost. He would later say that he envied his friends who died in the Ardennes, because at least they died believing someone was waiting for them at home. The letters themselves became historical documents, preserved in archives and family collections across Germany. Historians studying them note common themes like the attempt to protect families from worry, the nostalgia for childhood, the gradual realization that death was approaching. The handwriting often deteriorates in the final letters, showing hands shaking from cold or fear. Some letters have tear stains or blood on them. Others were never finished, breaking off mid-sentence when orders came to move out. These letters humanize what could otherwise be statistics about enemy casualties. Yes, these were German soldiers fighting for Nazi Germany, but they were also children caught in historical forces beyond their control or understanding. They had been indoctrinated from birth, given no alternative worldview, and thrown into combat before they could develop independent judgment. Their letters reveal not fanatical Nazis, but frightened boys trying to make sense of senseless circumstances. The mothers who received these last letters often became the keepers of memory. In the chaos of post-war Germany, with the country divided and millions displaced, these women preserved their sons' final words. They created informal networks, sharing grief and memories. Some spent decades trying to locate their sons' burial places, traveling to Belgium and France to stand where their boys had fallen. They placed flowers on military cemeteries, each grave marker representing a boy who had written home about missing mother's cooking or hoping to see spring flowers. Elizabeth Hoffmann received her son Peter's poetic last letter in February 1945. She memorized every word, reciting it to herself during the hungry years after the war, when merely surviving took all her energy. She would later say that her son's descriptions of frost on pine trees helped her see beauty in the world again, even though that same frost had likely contributed to his death from exposure. She died in 1987, and her family found hundreds of copies of Peter's letter that she had written out by hand, as if recreating his words could somehow bring him back. The German government after the war struggled with how to memorialize these losses. The teenage soldiers were victims of the Nazi regime, but also participants in its aggression. They died attacking democratic nations that were liberating Europe from tyranny. Yet they were also children who deserved to be mourned. This complexity has made their memory controversial and complicated in ways that continue to affect German society. The letters reveal the breakdown of Nazi ideology in the face of reality. Boys who had been raised on propaganda about German superiority wrote about American material abundance with awe and envy. They described captured American rations as feasts compared to their meager supplies. They noted American medical treatment of German prisoners with surprise, having been told Americans would torture and kill them. The cognitive dissonance between propaganda and reality appears throughout their final communications. Richard Braun, 17, wrote to his uncle on December 12 about seeing his first American prisoners. He had expected cowardly weaklings, but found healthy, well-equipped soldiers who seemed confident even in captivity. This observation troubled him enough that he spent a paragraph trying to reconcile it with what he had been taught. 4 days later, he would be killed attacking an American position that his unit had been told was weakly defended, but was actually held by veteran troops with overwhelming firepower. The futility of the offensive makes these deaths particularly tragic. Military historians agree that Germany had no realistic chance of success by December 1944. The offensive was born from Hitler's delusions rather than strategic necessity. The teenage soldiers died not defending their homeland, but in a failed attempt to prolong a war that was already lost. Their sacrifice achieved nothing except to delay the inevitable by a few weeks while causing immense suffering on all sides. The boys often wrote about their education being interrupted, revealing aspirations that would never be fulfilled. They mentioned plans to become engineers, doctors, teachers, farmers. They discussed books they wanted to read, places they wanted to visit, girls they wanted to marry. These normal teenage dreams stand in stark contrast to their circumstances, highlighting the waste of human potential that war represents. Otto Richter, 16, wrote extensively about his plans to study architecture after the war. He included sketches of buildings he wanted to design, inspired by the Belgian churches and farmhouses he saw. His artistic talent was evident even in pencil sketches made in a freezing bunker. He died on December 21st. His body found with his sketchbook still in his pack. The American soldier who found it kept it, and years later donated it to a museum, ensuring Otto's art survived even though he didn't. The final letters often included requests for forgiveness, though the boys rarely specified what they needed forgiveness for. This suggests an awareness that they were participating in something wrong, even if they couldn't articulate or fully understand it. The moral weight of their actions, even actions forced upon them by circumstances, appears to have troubled many of them in their final days. Johann Schmidt, 17, wrote to his former teacher asking forgiveness for things I have done in uniform that shame the education you gave me. He didn't elaborate, but his unit had participated in anti-partisan operations that included executing civilians. Whether Johann personally participated in atrocities or simply witnessed them, the moral burden was clearly weighing on him as he prepared for what he seemed to know would be his final battle. The physical condition of these teenage soldiers by December 1944 was pitiful. Medical examinations of captured and dead German soldiers from this period show widespread malnutrition, untreated diseases, and physical development problems from years of wartime deprivation. Boys who should have been at their physical peak were instead weakened by hunger and exhaustion before the battle even began. They were being asked to perform superhuman feats with bodies that were barely functional. The dental records of dead teenage soldiers showed severe tooth decay and gum disease from years of poor nutrition. Many had untreated infections that must have caused constant pain. Lice infestation was universal. Skin diseases were common. These physical ailments, combined with the psychological stress of combat, created suffering that the boys tried to hide in their letters home, but that occasionally broke through in admissions of exhaustion and illness. Fritz Zimmermann, 16, mentioned in his December 13th letter that he had lost several teeth and joked that he would need dental work when he got home. What he didn't mention was that the tooth loss was from scurvy, a disease of severe vitamin C deficiency that should have disappeared centuries ago but had returned due to the complete absence of fresh food in their rations. He died 3 days later, his body so malnourished that American medics initially thought he was even younger than his 16 years. The contrast between Nazi propaganda about creating superior human beings and the reality of these broken teenage bodies is stark. The regime that promised to forge a master race instead produced a generation of damaged children, physically and psychologically scarred by a war they had been bred to fight from birth. The letters home, trying to maintain an illusion of strength and health, make the reality even more poignant. As the battle progressed and casualties mounted, the replacement system broke down completely. Teenage soldiers found themselves commanded by other teenagers, as all the adults in their units were killed or wounded. Boys who had been in combat for less than a week were promoted to squad leaders, responsible for other boys who had just arrived at the front. The blind, were literally leading the blind into American machine gun fire. Helmut Wagner, 17, found himself commanding a squad of 15-year-olds after his sergeant was killed on December 18th. His letter home on December 19th, his last, showed a boy overwhelmed by responsibility he was completely unprepared for. He wrote about trying to keep the children safe, seemingly unaware that he was himself a child. He died the next day attempting to lead his squad in an attack that military professionals would have recognized as impossible. The communications between units broke down as the offensive stalled. Teenage soldiers found themselves isolated, not knowing where friendly forces were, where enemies might appear, or what their orders were supposed to be. Some groups wandered the forest for days, lost and freezing, until they stumbled into American positions, or simply collapsed from exhaustion. The grand offensive had devolved into scattered groups of boys trying to survive in a frozen forest. The propaganda machinery that had sustained German morale for years finally showed its emptiness to these teenagers. Promises of wonder weapons that would turn the tide meant nothing when they were armed with rifles that jammed in the cold. Claims of German superiority rang hollow when they saw American abundance and their own deprivation. The entire ideological structure they had been raised within collapsed along with the military situation. Ludwig Bauer, 16, wrote one of the most poignant last letters on December 15th. He told his parents that he had figured out that they had been protecting him from hard truths about the war, just as he was now protecting them from the truth about his situation. This mutual deception, born of love and desperation, characterized thousands of final letters. Families and soldiers collaborated in maintaining illusions because the truth was too terrible to share. The role of religion in these final letters deserves particular attention. As death approached, many boys returned to faiths their government had tried to suppress. They quoted Bible verses forbidden in Hitler Youth meetings. They asked for prayers from parents who had hidden their religious beliefs for years. They sought meaning in Christianity that National Socialism had failed to provide. The letters show a generation attempting to reconnect with spiritual traditions in their final hours. Christian Muller, raised secretly Catholic in a Nazi-dominated town, filled his last letter with religious imagery. He wrote about hoping to meet his deceased grandmother in heaven, about finding peace in prayer, about God's forgiveness being more important than the Führer's approval. His parents, reading this letter after his death, wept not just for their son, but for the faith he had found again, too late to save his life, but perhaps in time to save his soul. The American soldiers who faced these teenage Germans often expressed horror at killing such young enemies. Veterans described the shock of searching dead German soldiers for intelligence and finding pictures of school classes, letters from girlfriends who were clearly young teenagers, and identity documents showing births in 1927, 1928, even 1929. They had joined the war to fight Nazis and found themselves killing children. An American sergeant, John Patterson, wrote in his diary about a German attack on December 22nd that his unit repelled. When examining the dead attackers, they found only boys, the oldest perhaps 17. One was carrying a teddy bear in his pack. Another had a letter to his mother half-written in a notebook. Patterson wrote that his men were sickened by what they had done, even though they had no choice but to defend themselves. The enemy had become victims in a way that complicated the clear moral narrative of the war. The tactical incompetence displayed by units full of teenage soldiers contributed significantly to the offensive's failure. Boys who had never seen combat made basic mistakes that experienced soldiers would have avoided. They bunched up under artillery fire, making single shells devastatingly effective. They attacked across open ground in daylight. They failed to coordinate infantry and armor. Their bravery could not compensate for their ignorance of basic military tactics. December 20th saw some of the highest casualty rates among teenage soldiers. Multiple attacks ordered by desperate commanders trying to salvage something from the failing offensive resulted in what amounted to murder. Boys were sent running across open fields toward fortified American positions, armed with nothing but rifles and grenades against automatic weapons and artillery. Survivors described seeing entire units of teenagers mowed down in minutes, their bodies piling up in the snow. The medical services completely collapsed under the weight of casualties. Teenage soldiers with survivable wounds died from lack of treatment. Aid stations were overwhelmed, with wounded boys lying in hallways and outside in the snow. The few doctors available had to perform triage, choosing which boys might survive and which were beyond help. The rejected ones often died alone, calling for mothers who were hundreds of miles away. Doctors of miles away. Friedrich Hartmann, one of the few experienced military doctors still serving, wrote after the war about the impossible choices he faced. With medical supplies for perhaps 50 casualties, he had to choose among hundreds of wounded teenagers. He described boys begging him to save their friends instead of themselves, showing a selflessness that made the choices even more agonizing. He estimated that with adequate supplies and staff, 70% of the boys who died under his care could have been saved. The final collapse came at different times for different units, but by Christmas Day, most teenage soldiers who were still alive knew the offensive had failed. Some units simply dissolved, with boys slipping away in small groups, trying to find their way back to German lines or surrendering to the Americans. Others held their positions until overrun, following orders from commanders who had ceased to exist days earlier. The aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge saw thousands of German teenage soldiers in American POW camps. For many, this captivity saved their lives. They received food, medical treatment, and shelter that the German military could no longer provide. They would survive the war, though they would return to a destroyed nation where their entire worldview had been shattered along with the cities. Klaus Richter, 16, captured on December 27th, later described his relief at being taken prisoner. The Americans gave him the first hot meal he had eaten in weeks, treated his frostbite, and allowed him to write to his parents through the Red Cross. He spent the rest of the war in a POW camp in the United States, where he learned English, earned his high school equivalency, and began the long process of understanding how thoroughly he had been deceived by the system that had sent him to die. But for the 10,000 who died, there would be no redemption or re-education. They remained forever frozen in that December of 1944, boys who had written cheerful letters home while walking toward death. Their bodies were eventually collected and buried in military cemeteries, neat rows of crosses marking lives that had barely begun before they ended. Many graves remained marked, "Unknown German Soldier," because the boys carried no identification, or it had been destroyed by weather and violence. The letters they left behind became their only legacy. Families treasured these final communications, reading them repeatedly, searching for meaning in commonplace observations about weather or food. Mothers would trace their sons' handwriting with aged fingers, trying to feel some connection to boys who had been dead for decades. These letters became sacred objects, preserved in family archives, hidden during the communist years in East Germany, brought out only for private memorial occasions. Some families donated letters to historical archives, wanting their sons' words to serve as warnings about the cost of war and totalitarian ideology. These donations often came with photographs, showing boys in Hitler Youth uniforms, smiling at cameras, unaware of their fate. The contrast between these innocent faces and the circumstances of their deaths serves as a powerful indictment of the regime that sacrificed them. The German government has struggled with how to commemorate these losses. The teenage soldiers were both victims and participants in Nazi aggression. Monuments to German war dead are controversial, seen by some as honoring those who fought for an evil regime. Yet these boys were as much victims of Nazism as anyone, raised from birth to die for a twisted ideology they never had the chance to question. In Belgium, where many of these boys died, local communities have taken various approaches to this history. Some towns have created memorial sites that honor all war dead, regardless of nationality, recognizing the tragedy of young death, whatever the uniform. Others maintain strict separation between Allied and German burial sites, reflecting continued anger over occupation and atrocities. The teenage soldiers lie in both types of cemeteries, their youth making categorization as simple enemies difficult. The educational value of these letters has been recognized by historians and teachers, trying to convey the human cost of extremism and war. Reading a 17-year-old's thoughts about missing his mother's cooking makes the abstraction of casualty figures concrete and personal. Students can relate to boys their own age facing death, making historical events immediate and relevant in ways textbooks cannot achieve. Modern German military education includes study of these letters as warnings about the consequences of blind obedience and ideological fanaticism. Officer candidates read final letters from teenage soldiers who died following impossible orders, learning about Time, the moral obligation to question illegal or suicidal commands. The boys who couldn't question authority in 1944 have become teaching tools for ensuring such blind obedience never happens again. Psychological studies of the letters reveal patterns of coping with impending death. The boys used denial, focusing on future plans they must have known would never materialize. They used dissociation, describing their surroundings in detail while avoiding emotional content. They used bargaining, promising God or fate that they would be better people if allowed to survive. These coping mechanisms, visible in letters written 79 years ago, remain relevant to understanding how young people process trauma and mortality. The linguistic analysis of the letters shows the gradual breakdown of Nazi vocabulary as reality intruded. Early December letters use propaganda terms like heroic struggle and final victory. By mid-December, such phrases largely disappear, replaced by simple expressions of fear, cold, and homesickness. The ideological language that had shaped their thoughts since childhood proved inadequate for describing the reality of freezing to death in a foreign forest. The letters also reveal the diversity of the teenage soldiers, countering any monolithic view of the German military. Boys from cities wrote about missing theaters and cafes. Farm boys wrote about harvest seasons they wouldn't see. Catholic Bavarians included religious imagery while Protestant Prussians quoted Luther. Regional dialects occasionally broke through in emotional passages. These were not identical Nazi automatons but individual boys with distinct personalities and backgrounds, united only in their impending deaths. The relationship between the teenage soldiers and Belgian civilians, glimpsed in some letters, adds complexity to the narrative. Some boys wrote about kindnesses from civilians who gave them food or shelter despite the danger. Others described hostility from populations that saw them as invaders. A few fell in love with local girls, adding romantic tragedy to military disaster. These human connections across enemy lines highlight the arbitrary nature of the divisions that sent these boys to their deaths. Walter Hoffmann wrote about a Belgian farmer who had found him collapsed from exhaustion and had hidden him in a barn, giving him food and warmth before he rejoined his unit. The farmer had lost a son, also 17, in the German invasion of 1940. Walter wondered in his letter why this man had helped him, an enemy soldier who represented the forces that had killed his child. Such moments of humanity amidst horror appear throughout the letters, suggesting possibilities for reconciliation that war foreclosed. The environmental descriptions in the letters provide historical documentation of weather conditions and terrain. Boys described snow depths, temperatures, and ice formations that corroborate meteorological records. They wrote about specific forests, streams, and villages, creating an unintentional geography of their final movements. Military historians have used these descriptions to reconstruct battle movements and understand tactical decisions that official records don't explain. The gradual change in handwriting quality across December letters tells its own story. Early December letters show careful penmanship, learned in German schools, that emphasized proper writing. By mid-December, the writing becomes shaky, letters are malformed, and ink is smudged. Whether from cold, exhaustion, fear, or all three, the physical act of writing became increasingly difficult. Some final letters are barely legible, the boys' last words almost lost to physical deterioration that preceded their deaths. The censorship stamps on many letters provide insight into the German military's declining control. Early December letters show evidence of careful censorship, with lines blacked out and pages removed. By late December, letters that clearly violate censorship rules pass through unchanged, suggesting the system was breaking down or censors no longer cared about maintaining illusions. The boys' final truths escaped because the machinery of control was failing along with everything else. Some letters included drawings and sketches, revealing artistic talents that would never develop. Boys drew their surroundings, their comrades, remembered scenes from home. These images, often more eloquent than words, show a need to create even while facing destruction. A sketch of a forest shrine, a portrait of a friend, a remembered view from a childhood window. These visual letters speak across decades about young lives seeking beauty even in ugliness. The packages that accompanied letters home tell their own stories. Boys sent back personal effects they wanted, preserved like photographs, rings, watches, and medals. Some included enemy souvenirs, American cigarettes, or chocolate, small trophies from a war they were losing. Others sent natural objects, pressed flowers, interesting stones, pine cones, as if trying to share their environment with families they would never see again. These objects became relics, preserved alongside letters in family collections. The role of friendship appears throughout the letters. Boys wrote about comrades who had become brothers, sharing fear and food, warmth and wisdom. They asked parents to contact dead friends' families, to share memories and grief. They described pacts to look after each other's families if one survived and another didn't. These bonds, formed under extreme conditions, often seemed stronger than family ties, forged by shared suffering that no one at home could understand. Ernst Wagner wrote extensively about his friend Karl, also 17, who came from a town 500 miles from Ernst's home. They had met in training, bonded over shared interests in music and literature, and sworn to visit each other's families after the war. When Karl was killed on December 19th, Ernst wrote to Karl's parents, introducing himself as their son's best friend, sharing stories about Karl's last days, promising to visit them if he survived. Ernst died 3 days later, but his letter reached Karl's family, providing them with comfort about their son's final friendship. The question of agency haunts these letters. How much choice did these boys have? They were conscripted into military service. Refusing meant execution or imprisonment. They were products of 12 years of Nazi education, knowing no alternative worldviews. They were children following adults' orders in situations they couldn't fully understand. Yet they were also pulling triggers, participating in aggression, contributing to suffering however unwillingly. The letters show boys struggling with this moral complexity without having the vocabulary or maturity to fully articulate it. The impact on German society of losing so many teenage boys in a brief period was profound and lasting. Villages lost entire age cohorts of young men. Schools had graduating classes with no male survivors. Sports clubs, youth organizations, and social structures built around these boys simply ceased to exist. The demographic hole created by their deaths affected marriage patterns, birth rates, and social development for decades. The mothers of these dead boys formed an invisible sisterhood of grief in post-war Germany. They met in cemeteries, churches, and eventually in organized support groups. They shared letters, photographs, and memories. They advocated for recognition of their sons as victims of the regime rather than simply enemy combatants. They aged into grandmothers who never were, carrying grief that time didn't diminish. Margaret Bauer, whose son Friedrich died, commanding his teenage platoon, spent 30 years trying to locate the families of boys who had served under her son. She collected their letters, compiled their stories, and created an unofficial memorial document that she distributed to families. Her work, entirely personal and unfunded preserved memories that official histories overlooked. She died in 1980, her apartment full of photographs of boys she had never met, but whose mothers she had comforted. The economic circumstances that many families faced added practical urgency to grief. With fathers often dead or missing and older sons killed in battle, the teenage boys who died in the Ardennes had often been expected to support families after the war. Their deaths meant not just emotional loss, but economic catastrophe for widowed mothers and younger siblings. The letters' promises to help rebuild family homes or businesses became particularly poignant when those promises could never be fulfilled. The International Red Cross played a crucial role in delivering final letters and death notifications across the chaos of collapsing Germany. Red Cross workers described the terrible duty of bringing final letters to families who didn't yet know their sons were dead. Sometimes they arrived to find homes destroyed and families dispersed. Letters would follow refugees across occupation zones, occasionally taking years to reach recipients. Some were never delivered, ending up in archives where they wait for families that may no longer exist. The literary quality of many letters has attracted scholarly attention. Despite limited education disrupted by war, many boys showed remarkable eloquence when facing death. They found metaphors for their experience, created poetry from horror, and achieved insights that seemed beyond their years. This suggests that extreme circumstances can accelerate emotional and intellectual development, forcing children to become philosophers while they were still learning to be adults. One remarkable letter came from Wilhelm Hartmann, 17, who had wanted to become a writer. His final letter, written over 3 days in mid-December, was essentially a short story about a soldier who might or might not have been himself, experiencing the war through a dreamlike narrative that captured the surreal nature of their situation. He wrote about snow that fell upward, trees that bled, and time that moved backward. This literary experiment, created in a freezing bunker while waiting to attack, shows a creative mind trying to process impossible circumstances through art. The musical references in many letters reflect the importance of music in German culture and its role in maintaining morale. Boys wrote about songs they sang together, humming melodies while marching, and remembering concerts attended before the war. Some included lyrics to folk songs, asking families to sing them at Christmas. Music became a bridge between the battlefield and home, a shared cultural experience that transcended physical separation. The technological limitations of 1944 make these letters particularly precious. There were no phone calls home, no emails or video chats. These handwritten pages were the only connection between the battlefield and home. Every word had to be chosen carefully because paper was limited and delivery uncertain. This forced economy of expression gave the letters an intensity that modern communication, with its casual abundance, rarely achieves. As historians continue to discover and analyze these letters, new insights emerge about the final phase of Nazi Germany. The letters provide ground-level views of how ideology collapsed when confronted with reality. They show how propaganda failed to sustain morale when boys were freezing and starving. They document the breakdown of military discipline, social order, and ultimately the entire Nazi project through the eyes of its youngest soldiers. The preservation efforts for these letters face challenges. Paper deteriorates, ink fades, and families who saved them are dying off. Digitization projects are racing to preserve these documents before they're lost forever. Each letter saved represents not just one boy's story, but a piece of evidence about how societies can fail their children, how ideology can consume generations, and how individual humanity persists even in dehumanizing circumstances. In schools across modern Germany, these letters are sometimes read aloud on Remembrance Days. 17-year-old students read words written by 17-year-olds who died before Germany could become the democracy these students inhabit. The emotional impact of these readings, youth speaking to youth across decades, creates connections that traditional history education cannot achieve. The dead boys become contemporaries, rather than historical abstractions. The question of whether these boys were heroes, victims, or villains has no simple answer. They were products of their time, shaped by forces they didn't choose and couldn't resist. They showed courage in facing death, loyalty to comrades, and love for families. They also participated in aggression that caused immense suffering. Their letters reveal them as complex human beings rather than simple categories, forcing readers to grapple with moral ambiguity rather than comfortable certainty. The final letters of these 10,000 teenage soldiers stand as testimony to war's ultimate crime, which is the theft of future. Every boy who died in December 1944 represented decades of unlived life, relationships that would never form, children who would never be born, contributions to society that would never be made. The letters, with their hopes and plans and dreams, make visible the invisible loss that extends far beyond the immediate tragedy of death. As December 1944 faded into January 1945, the last letters from the Battle of the Bulge reached German homes. Families read final words from boys already buried in foreign soil. The offensive had failed completely, achieving nothing except adding to war's casualty lists. The teenage soldiers had died for nothing, their sacrifice meaningless except as a warning about the cost of totalitarianism and aggressive war. Today, nearly 80 years later, these letters remain powerful documents about the human cost of political extremism. They remind us that behind every military statistic is an individual story, that every soldier was someone's child, that every death in war represents not just a present loss, but a future stolen. The 10,000 German teenagers who wrote last letters home in December 1944 speak across decades about the price of ideology, the vulnerability of youth, and the persistent humanity that survives even in history's darkest chapters.